So welcome everybody. And we've now reached not even the end of a first full week, which would sort of be, I don't know, for those of you who used to be at Convergence, it sort of feels like we're at that first evening dinner where we've started to see how can people connect and who might be here and what delicious conversations we might need to have. But in this case, we've still got a whole chunk of time out ahead of us to continue to process this and move through it. So why don't we get started? The next slide. So we're gonna recap the previous week, just do some insights from each conversation. And I'll drive this a little bit, but I mean, I'll drive this a good bit because we've synthesized this as a team. But I would welcome anybody to put additional comments into the chat or insights. And hopefully as we go through this, we'll have a little bit of time to add color as we go through and take some comments from the crowd in terms of what you noticed.
And to that point as well, the groups for the conversations are now open from last week as well. So anything that you put into the chat, we're going to move over and put into the group as well. So yeah.
Great. Gotta love workplace. So then we're going to tee up the sessions that are for this week and some more tips and tricks in terms of navigating this event space that we have. So officially, we've never done this before this is the 17th is the charm. And if you get to the 17th, thank you very much, Suzanne. If you get to the 17th, you hit your goals. Our goal was actually 60. That was our solid goal because I mean, as I hope you're noticing, this is a good amount of customization, but we just couldn't say no. And I just talked LD into letting one more person in. So we're still getting people who want in, but we are officially very, very much sold out. So thank you. Next. All right. So thinking back, and again, I love this tip of that you can make the people bigger or the deck bigger as you slide the middle bar over. So if you just pull it with your cursor, you can make the deck smaller or the people smaller, depending on what you want to see. But then I would also encourage you to drop things into the chat. And if you want me to pause or you really want to say something that's super important, just flag it and LD will get my attention. All right, so the kickoff session was really focused on how do we bridge conversations where people bring different kinds of expertise, and how do new possibilities get created when these sectors converge. And I would say we're already starting to see, I have watched in each one of the conversations since then, an elegant, graceful approach of people learning from each other. And I just want to honor how amazing all of you have been in these conversations and jumping in from a place of trust and starting to have those pretty transparent conversations. I do want to name, and this is going to be a theme throughout so much of Convergence, but these can be addressed again. This theme's going to be picked up in the final week. We have these implementation sessions, and one's on translation and one's on how to build collaborations between gender-based violence organizations and finance. And I think some of the insights that we sparked on the first conversation will flow through to those implementation conversations in the end. Second, LD, next. So, this conversation was, I loved it. I thought this was my first one, and it was just, I just want to, again, we wandered into this and said, can we recreate what we do in person, face to face? And I couldn't have asked for a great set of people to do this with. The insights out of this around the cost of inaction of gender-based violence at least for me and some others on the team, really centered in on, it's one thing to know what the cost of an action are now, but how can we do predictive models of future costs of, if this is what it costs now, how can we more clearly predict what will it cost in the future? And my sense is that while we imply that in some of the costing strategies that exist now around gender-based violence, it's not sort of worked through. And the last piece is, we had a full conversation about sort of the perils of instrumentality, of what happens when gender-based violence only matters because there's an economic cost attached to it. And how do we navigate through that? So this is going to be picked up. There's a lot of the costing data that is actually being used in how infrastructure projects look at gender-based violence. This predictive modeling is going to tie into the research conversation that we're having in implementation. And in about a week, we are going to have another context conversation about COVID-19. And I think these conversations of how the costs of inaction have increased during COVID, we'll come back to that. Next one.
Joy, if I may, this exactly what Joy is saying around how these initial framing conversations connect to future conversations. This is why, even if you weren't part of conversation one, we've made the group public so that you can gain that context if you're in one of the conversations that this kind of connects to.
Exactly. All right, so the next one was looking at a mega trend and sort of how does gender-based violence operate? Is it a mega trend? We came to no definitive answers, that's for sure. I'm curious, the synthesis for everybody else in that group, it was a pretty intense conversation about sort of what would it take to have it constitute as a megatrend? But I do think there were two things that really were balanced. One is, what would it take to do the research, build out the research methodologies that would make the connection? Because we don't have those methodologies. We don't know how to connect gender-based violence as a megatrend, what data sets would be needed. And so there's a little bit of, how would we prove that we could do this? We can't know if it's really a megatrend and how much impact it has on finance until we actually do some of that research. The problem is, the second part of that conversation, the sort of balance, was the reluctance by analysts and others, folks on boards, to even be willing to look at gender-based violence. And so in that, we came up with an interesting idea at the back end, sort of in our synthesis of this. We thought about how do we think about the different ways that we can frame gender-based violence for people in finance, and think about the potential results of those different frames. And so, for example, we might want to just think about gender-based violence as addressing gender-based violence is a necessary requirement of looking at gender equality. Okay, maybe we should just focus on gender equality and not lead with gender-based violence. And so how do we sort of make gender-based violence a little more accessible, but how do we balance that with just putting it in people's faces? So that was a lot of the conversation. This will continue to play out in some of these future conversations. So maybe the next slide. So this was a conversation that Christina and Tia led. And these were the two ideas that were sort of called out, but if anybody else who was in the conversation wants to drop things in, thinking about, I love this idea of thinking about a continuum of the experience of the survivor and what is necessary at each point in that continuum. Because it is not just a moment where one experiences violence and then then the next day recovers, right? It's a long continuum, and what's needed at different points. And then this question of how do we really balance the personal needs and the public needs for awareness? LD, do you want to phrase that one better?
Yeah, no problem. Christina actually dropped into the chat a survival process, as one participant put it. I think that's the continuum you're referring to there, Christina, correct? Yes, head nod. And then the second piece, and by all means, jump in here if you want to, but in terms of that tension point, just really, there was great conversation from a framing perspective of to make sure that the individual needs of a survivor are not eclipsed by the public need for awareness and education, and how can we do better in balancing those very different ends of a very complex situation, respectfully, and also not speaking for those, allowing them to speak for themselves. Christina, go ahead.
I was just going to say, not speaking for them, but also not putting all the burden on survivors to elevate awareness and increase understanding of the issue.
Oh, great point. So the two conversations where I think this question of a survivor lens, and useful to think about is there a difference between, we could toss out all lenses and rip off our glasses, but there's a kind of sense of a gender lens, a gender-based violence lens, and then I sort of loved this focus on what's the difference between that and really seeing things as a survivor from the survivor lens, and that particular point of view, which is different than a broader gender-based violence lens. So next one, LD. And I would actually name this conversation very much built on that last one, which was, and this was one of the more, I don't know, it was an amazingly transformative conversation for me, because I've been sort of running on this idea of, wouldn't it be great if we told a story of a future without gender-based violence, and what would that look like, and how do we name that? And sort of two real takeaways. One was some of the macro level indicators of gender-based violence going down are not real for many people, right? So we could look at high-level indicators, but the folks that Rosalind serves in Kenya are not in that category. How do we get really realistic that we're not washing over some pretty deep structural inequalities, and that what we really need to be thinking about is not just a future without gender-based violence, but the instability of inequality and how that will stay with us as long as there is inequality. The second piece is this kind of profound statement of getting there and being there is the same thing. So a future without gender-based violence would require education to change, norms to change, sort of roles between men and women to shift, senses of masculinity would have, like, all of this would have had to change to get to a point where there's a future without gender-based violence. So the process by which we would get there and what it would look like there is the same thing. I've been pondering that a lot since then. So thanks so much to Futures Without Violence is putting together a little short presentation for us to talk through their picture of why a future without violence sort of matters. And then later this week, we have this delightful norms change conversation about the relationship between norms change and investments coming up. These are all going to start weaving together, either that or you guys have to move into my brain or something, which would be alarming. Okay, next one. And then the last conversation was looking at this linkage between women's economic empowerment and the prevention of gender-based violence. And I think the parallel with the survivor conversation is, from the perspective of survivors, just get the money out with less strings, and how do we sort of build better mechanisms to do that? And so that if you are a survivor of gender-based violence, complex women's economic empowerment programs that go through many stages and have lots of metrics, why aren't we trusting the people to use the money the way that they need it? And so too many strings attached to the overall process. But in general, I think the beginning in that conversation of really practicing what does women's economic empowerment look like from a gender lens investor, so Lauren and others who sort of sit in the world of gender lens investing, and women's economic empowerment is an investment area where you can move money to make a difference on gender-based violence, and the range of how different that is from you're in a NGO launching a women's economic development program or a women's economic empowerment program. The sort of depth of awareness across those different perspectives varies widely. So really thinking about many different lenses on women's economic empowerment.
And we actually have a comment added in, Lori. One reality is that you can't reduce violence against women without gender equality, but gender equality alone will not totally eliminate violence against women and children. Thank you, Lori.
That was and she was very much a leader in the getting there and being there, the same thing. Any other comments that people want to call out? Maybe we could just close the deck for a couple minutes and see if there's any things that people want to shout out of your insights from the week. You're all on mute, so you just have to come off and, all right.
Hi.
Oh, Easter, hello.
How are you?
I'm good. What's your insight from the week?
I look at the issues of gender equality, but I also look at how to ensure equity at the lower levels, because we can speak about equity, but then when we look at the gender equality, yes, but in terms of at the different levels in which people are, how do we ensure equity for people who are at spaces where they've not been able to get access to services?
Yep.
So some of the structural violence which we see is because we talk about equality on paper, but in terms of service delivery and access, there have been structural barriers which then ensure that they're not able to be there. So we can have numbers as there, then we'll say, yes, we have numbers, everybody is getting access, but still we have those challenges. So
Right.
Part of it is that if we are able to start thinking about services and access and voice at that particular level, then it will be different. Then we can then start taking away that, then we can actually then get to where we are going to have equality and have those people speaking about getting service at that level for themselves.
Great, thanks.
That's my
Easter.
takeaway.
Oh, wonderful. Julia, did you want to throw in something? Nope, you were on, nope. Okay, any other comments?
We had a comment from Victoria about one key takeaway. Victoria, I'm not sure if you're on the call. I'll just read it out because it was put into chat. One key takeaway for Victoria was the trap we fall into by counting women, number of jobs, number of entrepreneurs, and not measuring true impact and the ripple effect of women's economic empowerment and eliminating GBV.
So what's great about these sort of framing conversations to start? Did somebody want to jump in?
Okay, yes, Joy, thank you very much. I think from my end, I would observe that economic empowerment is very important for women, because this is one way in which women would find security, social security, and in terms of safeguarding their spaces where they'll be empowered to access decision-making spaces, be able to be in leadership processes where they can be able to influence issues affecting them. Because if they are not economically empowered, it means that somebody else will be sitting somewhere to make decisions on their behalf. And I think it would not really augur well to the intended beneficiary. So I would really go with the aspect of economic empowerment for women so that they have that leverage in terms of having the strength of representing themselves and also getting their voices heard in different spaces of
Okay.
representation.
Great.
Yep.
Thank you, Shadra. Maybe I'll turn it back to you, LD, to walk through the rest of the sort of overview for next week.
Yep, absolutely. So, okay, everyone see? Great.
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So it was a big week. I mean, we kicked off in 2 sessions and we had 5 amazing conversations. That was the framing conversations. All of them are been recorded and shared within the groups. So again, if you need to come back to that framing place and gain more knowledge, those are available. Really excited that we're starting into strategy and design both this week. It's a really exciting, dense week of conversations. And we're very much already thinking about how they will feed into the implementation conversations coming up. So just to kind of recenter our brains on what's happening this week. This week, very exciting, lots going on. We have 3 live context sessions. Our first one is immediately following this first weekly roundup. Joy is going to talk us through finance as a tool for social change.
And there is a exclusive release that's happening at the beginning that if you want to stay for the first 10 minutes, and then there's an exclusive release that we're very excited about. Sorry.
Yeah, a little announcement to kick off week 2 of Convergence. And then later this week, we have our 2 context sessions for strategy, 5 strategies to use finance to address GBV, and a panel discussion. I'd also like to point out we have loaded a pre-recorded context session called a model portfolio in faith case study under design. We wanted to make sure we published that sooner rather than later, even though we're not quite into design, but our weeks are so dense that, yeah, we wanted to make sure you had time to watch that. It's about half an hour long, if that is of interest to you. Then to recap, we have 11 conversations this week, which is fantastic. So 11 in total over strategy and design. We have 5 strategy conversations, the imperative intersectionality in the context in financing, the reduction of GBV, incorporating a GBV lens into impact investing, advocating for corporate culture and practices that reduce GBV through our investments, valuing norms change in the market risk created by GBV, and using data about GBV in sectors to inform investment risk and opportunity. So really exciting strategy conversations coming up. As well, followed by 6 design conversations. And so I think as well, just from a expectation perspective, framing is really kind of setting the stage. Strategy is starting to think about how to, think about it to move things forward. And the design is going to be probably a little bit more active. I mean, the conversations were all very active, even in framing, which was fantastic. But it's that design conversation we kind of shift into a little bit more workshop-y vibes. And so coming up, we have financing innovations and financial technologies, financing livelihoods, infrastructure, political risk, direct service and response, and operational risk created by employees working from homes, which I think is going to be a fantastically fascinating conversation.
Can I say though, LD, I am most looking forward to the financing direct service and response, because there's many, many people who come here who said, I work on the ground and I need to figure out how to finance direct service, not fund philanthropically, but are there financing mechanisms that could make a difference on the ground? So hopefully we'll solve all kinds of problems in that one and release it out to the world.
Very, very cool. So our intention and hope is to record all of these again and make them publicly available as it's okay for us to make them publicly available. You'll notice the groups will become public, and you'll see posts in the general group letting you know when that's the case. So just quickly to kind of wrap us up before we get into the context session, a couple of workplace tips and tricks. We just want to say a huge thank you to you all for investing your time in onboarding to the workplace experience. We recognize it's a new process. Even if you're a Facebook user, it feels kind of new. So thank you for that. The groups for the last conversations are now open, as mentioned. We're also going to be adding after this call circles, which are essentially groups as well. But these are just recognizing from last week and also getting to know you all through your profiles and whatnot, that there might be some divergent conversations or connections that we want to help facilitate. So we're going to leave these as open groups. You can choose to join them. You will see them in Workplace available, and you can opt in, as it were. The 5 categories we're seeing right now is translators, a group just for East Africa, one around process metrics, faith-based organizations, and then public equities. We are not going to define what happens in these circles. It's more, here's a conversation. It's like if we had a meeting room and we said, you can check out this room if this is of interest to you, to make connections with other people. So really it's just a digital way to gather. Also wanted to call out, have you checked out the directory? Seeing a lot of great activity on Workplace. We wanted to just let you know officially that, of course, you're welcome to reach out to each other directly. You don't have to wait for us. So if you want to connect with people in different spheres and worlds, check out directory, and you can actually private message people just like chat with Facebook. Another tip and trick is your own profile is a place where you can share articles, links, research, or more information about you or your organization. Just again, to facilitate that enriching of relationships. And in support of that as well, wanted to call it that if you haven't already downloaded the app to your phone for Workplace, we recommend you do that too, so you can be more involved in a real-time fashion. But calling out that the Workplace chat app, just like with Facebook and Messenger being separate, it's also 2 apps for Workplace. So make sure to check your chat. If you might be getting private messages now and not even know it. I found this really exciting, so I just wanted to share it because you've all onboarded to Workplace so fantastically. We're trending up. Everyone's, we're seeing more momentum and excitement and energy on Workplace. And this is really exciting, I think, for us as a whole. So thank you for that. Also wanted to call out something really cool. Do you know we have 11 countries participating with 81 delegates from around the world? This is truly a digital conference. You can see where people are from by going to directory. So if you were moved to perhaps, I'm in Toronto, Canada. If I wanted to get to know all the Canadians at Convergence, I can go to directory and see where everyone's at, send a private message and go from there. Yeah. And
well, either that or the Australians and the Canadians with 8 from each could probably have some sort of a sports game of some kind. I don't know what you need 8 people for, but it could be, I don't know how many. You need a lot more of that.
It would definitely be hockey for Canada. 5 people a shift plus goalie. We're good to go. But
all right, it's going to be hockey. I was looking at you, Clea, and thinking maybe it could be water polo or something, but no, that takes more people and a different direction. All right.
So we're just feeling the energy. Thank you very much. This has been a great weekly roundup. Trying to synthesize and consolidate the big ideas, get you guys excited and aware of the mindset going into this week. Of course, if you have any issues or questions, please feel free to contact your relationship manager. And I think we're right at time to begin context session number 1. So we're going to